Welcome to the Open Loop podcast. It's a podcast exploring the people, companies, and ideas shaping the future of neurotechnology. I'm Chay Carter, the founder of Carter Sciences, Recce Neuro, and the Neurotech newsletter. In each episode, I sit down with founders, operators, researchers, investors, and leaders building the edge of neuroscience, neurotechnology, and healthcare. We'll have honest conversations about people's journeys into the neurotech industry, what they're currently building, how it's going, the realities, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and what the future holds for the neurotech industry in general.
Welcome to the latest edition of the podcast. I'm joined today by Jordi Parramon. Thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Jordi, I'm going to jump straight into this. Obviously, some exciting developments in the world of Nexus NeuroTech Ventures recently, but you've got quite a unique background. I think the neurotech space and the investment space in particular is often full of different types of backgrounds, some more traditional finance routes, and yours is definitely more of a traditional medical device route. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your background and where you started and what you've worked on over the years before we get into the financy stuff?
Sure, yeah. And try to be brief. Yeah, my journey, I studied physics and electrical engineering, and my initial trade was doing microchip designs for implantable applications, because if you have an implant, you need to have things very small and very low power, and that's where custom ASICs and microchips make a ton of sense. So I started with a very kind of a clear technical kind of background, because you have to start somewhere, and it is always good to have that kind of foundation. And my first job was in a very emerging new space in the late 90s, which now is the neuromodulation business, but at the time was very, very niche and small. And that's how I started in a startup called INSIGHTEC in Los Angeles. And then we were acquired by Boston Scientific, and I can observe from first row seat the evolution, the growth and maturity a little bit of the business, diversifying into a few clinical indications, but always with a lens of how technology, my lens was how technology can disrupt the clinical offering so that you have a competitive advantage. That kind of was my scope. As an example of the things I did at Boston Scientific, one of the teams I had was developing the technology platform for the future. So we had to develop in the middle of 2000s, the basis, which was that kind of architecture will be useful for every single future implant, different businesses, even deep brain stimulation or spinal cord, etc. And that was one of the things I did, which I'm very, very proud to say that even today, this architecture is still being pretty much used for every single product that Boston Scientific sells in the neuro space. So that was great. But then with time, I learned that technology is only one piece, and being successful with the products and the services requires much, much more. And I wanted to learn more on that. That's why I started getting over time more and more exposure on that other side of the business, on the commercial side, first clinical development and commercial side. Then I moved to Verily, which was a spin out of Google X, part of the Alphabet kind of cluster of companies. There I was able to have a lot of visibility into many different areas of healthcare, because until then was very focused only on neuro first and technology. And Verily Life Science, I had exposure to cardiovascular, metabolic, surgical robotics, drug deliveries, and you name it. And that was a fascinating journey. Also dealing with pharma companies and dealing with payers and providers, etc. was broadened my span of understanding before I jumped into investment, which is my last thing.
Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating working at Boston Scientific at the emergence of the neuromodulation space, right? There's obviously so much happening in that market right now, and Boston Scientific's approach right now seems to be very much in the M&A space. There's a couple of really, really big acquisitions. Axonics probably stealing the show, but Valencia and Nalu and Relievant as well, actually, just building huge portfolios. What was it like then? I guess they acquired Advanced Bionics. They were still doing it back in the 2000s.
First of all, it was the acquisition was in 2004, and to this day, adjusted by inflation, is still the largest M&A in the history of neuromodulation.
Right.
It was $3 billion once you factorize the earnouts that the former shareholders had. We had little revenue, but at the time, Boston was mostly a catheter company. It was before the Guidant acquisition. But shortly after they acquired us and acquired Guidant, and for a period of time, there was a bit of a legal divide between what was Advanced Ionics and the employees there versus the rest of the company. There was some sort of legal fight in terms of control of the company between the former shareholders and new owners. And so that gave us a window of time, let's say 5 years, where we continued to operate pretty much like a startup. And that allows to make really very rapid progress to grow the revenue, diversify into DBS as well. But over time, though, and once the lawsuits were settled, then the division became more of a slowly but surely more and more integrated into what is the Boston Scientific proper. But it was very interesting to witness that because it was not a very fast, it was a slow transition and learning about what each phase means from a cultural perspective, from a process, from relationships was really interesting.
And you obviously brought that platform too to a very, very profitable space, which is now a very big and busy market. The spinal cord stimulation space, obviously DBS too. There's tons of innovation happening in that. What was that like in the early stages of that world?
Well, so just to give you some numbers, my first project there when I started was a project called the Bion Microstimulator, which actually, in retrospective, was one of the main reasons why Boston acquired Advanced Ionics, because it was such a disruptive technology. It was a miniature battery-powered injectable device that had 3 millimeters diameter, but it had a lithium-ion battery at the time where lithium-ion batteries were not even in cell phones. So we're way ahead, and wireless communication, etc. So just to give you a sense, we developed the full implant with 5 people in 2 years. So that speed of innovation was like amazing, right? You could do things that are difficult to do today. And then you have all these overheads and you have all these constraints. But it's very inspiring, though, to have experienced these things because you know what is possible. And then once things become more complicated, you always try to go back how we did it last time and then what we can do to improve the status quo. So it's been always a reference for me.
That's fantastic. Yeah. I wonder if there's any similar sort of technological advancements, R&D environments right now, which kind of match that from that era, because I think what came to market at the time was, like you said, so rapid.
Yeah, I mean, there's much more investment now because that was very concentrated in a few areas, and now there's a lot of these startups and companies that they're diversifying their focus and the areas that they focus. But if you look at the last 20 years, I was just doing some numbers the other day. I was talking with somebody, and if you look at the 2020 versus 2026, exactly 20 years from today, the revenue numbers have grown approximately 10% CAGR. The number of procedures have only grown half of that, 5% CAGR.
Wow.
What it means that the companies have shifted their focus into high price, high margins businesses at the expense of penetration. So that's one data point in Neuromod. The second data point in the last 20 years is that of the main indications that drive revenue, there was only one new indication from that time, which is hypoglossal nerve stimulation for sleep apnea. But all the other indications already had market access, even though maybe modest, many of them. But what it means also been not very effective at diversifying the use of bioelectronics and neuromodulation in the space. So it's just something to reflect about.
Yeah, that's interesting, actually, isn't it? I think we see, the spinal cord stimulation, deep brain stimulation, hypoglossal nerve stimulation, obviously the newest with Inspire and Nixo and a couple of other startups kicking around that space. And I think LivaNova are about to enter that market, and LivaNova in the vagus nerve stimulation market. Vagus nerve is probably the one maybe with, the most exciting potential from an indication expansion perspective. Companies like SetPoint, for instance, in that market. But yeah, I think the neurotech space, neuromodulation probably feels like one of the first seeds that was planted, but it's expanded into so many different areas now with neuronavigation, neuroimaging, so forth, even brain computer interfaces, wearable EEG. But the neuromodulation market feels almost like old school, dare I say, compared to the rest of the market.
That's right, and I think we have to learn from the past and figure out. To me, there are two main problems I would really like to see solved. One is how to have a 10x scale on the patient access and penetration perspective. And And I do think that you need to, in order to do that, you need to combine invasive technologies with less invasive ones and connect that all through the patient journey. So that's the number one, which is we do have to get better at accessing patients. Just one more number, the annual penetration, like how new patients per year and how many of these patients serve on Neuromod was around 1.5% in 2006. It's now it's slightly more than 4%, but it's still very small number. So this is one challenge for people, right? How can we do that? The second challenge, as I was alluding, is in the indication diversification. And yes, there's some efforts on, but I do think that we lack sometimes either the science or the speed to clinical translation that is making this quite difficult. So for the new founders and venture people that really want to bet in the future is how can we really diversify much more the clinical use of these technologies? Because the nervous system is the most relevant biological lever that will ever exist because the nervous system controls everything, right? So it's just the opportunity is still, we're just scratching it.
And you mentioned obviously the wearable space too, and that wearables market drifts sometimes into the direct-to-consumer space, which is again probably got more questionable clinical validation than obviously the medical device community. But it also at the same time shines a light on neurotechnology, the nervous system in general, and how we can actually activate it, enhance it, repair it using stimulatory devices or other types of devices. What are your thoughts on that? It's probably a good thing that people are talking about it more and it's getting more mainstream attention, but there's obviously a lot of rogue players in that space that are selling devices on Amazon that maybe don't have the clinical validation. I mean, it's a double-edged sword to some degree. We want to draw attention to it, but yeah, what do you think about that? Because I think a large part of it comes down to the general public understanding it more.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I do think that consumer devices play and will play a bigger role in healthcare because they have the capacity to scale in a way that it's going to be difficult with technologies that require the traditional prescription, regulatory reimbursement pathway channels. So it is important that we don't lose sight of this tool because that can actually add, I think, tremendous value. I mean, the question is always the how, right? How you translate that to value, and the reality is, I was very close to that. When I was at Google, we acquired Fitbit, and one of the companies that we invested at Nexus was heavily entrenched with Apple on monitoring by a single, etc. It is true that right now, at least the business models of all these companies that are the manufacturers of the consumer devices, their primary objective is to sell more devices. And healthcare is a mechanism for them to expand the interest of the consumer. And so that right now, that's where it is. But that may change over time, right? If we can find ways to monetize the value that those devices do 24/7, maybe these companies can be more open to embrace that. Although the resistance will still be high because there's a lot of liabilities involved with the healthcare, etc. It's complicated, but nevertheless, they are already playing an important role, and their role will continue to grow. So one of the questions I will put to more of the traditional medtech companies is, how can we think about models where the coexistence between regulated and less regulated, I say less because sometimes there's some regulation, but they're very kind of weak labels. How can the coexistence of the two can multiply the healthcare value? For example, and this is happening already, right? Apple Watches can monitor and giving you warnings if you potentially can have a sleep apnea. That's a very natural connection between these and a company like ResMed, right? That provides a device that can do that, and examples like this can help us to frame the problems in the right light and making sure that there's value for everybody.
Yeah, there's a lot of big conversation as well, I think, in the consumer business around EEG technology and obviously brain recording, brain data signal recording. And obviously, as I wear my Apple headphones here, I think a lot of people talk about the Apple patent on EEG headphones, which is really fascinating. There's companies like Nexus, for instance, who are doing it at the moment for sleep.
I know very well the founder. He was at Google X.
Excellent, excellent. I mean, it's in a really amazing space. I think form factor is going to be a big factor in that space too. But you're absolutely right. There's lots of medical device companies I speak to who are traditional medical device salespeople, for instance, or executives who are saying, if a company goes down the consumer path, it's actually detrimental to them becoming a respected medical device industry. There's almost this old school mentality that, hey, you've got to be one or the other, and you have to own it, and there's no crossing over once you go to the other side, which I think is like an old school mentality. It's not pretty what the future's going to look like. And like you said, yeah, the EEG piece, the sleep apnea stuff, or different wearables, it's all going to be part of it. I think the reality is it's just about the general public becoming more used to wearing technology, which we already are with Aura rings and so forth as well, and accepting the fact that I think brain data as a topic is going to be the next frontier of medical technology, as we already have a lot of diagnostic tools and so forth that we can wear for different things. So it's going to be interesting.
Yeah, and I think there's this general trend where on the digital healthcare ecosystems will be more naturally integrated, either through traditional EHRs or these new players. But you combine that higher presence, higher touch point. Now with all these upcoming AI agents that will provide more useful value, and then the natural thing will be connect this with technology that people have at hand as well. So all these things together, maybe now is the right, the time where these things will start happening for real. Haven't happened too much yet, but it's really a great opportunity coming up.
Yeah, there's certainly a re-emergence of EEG technology as a result of machine learning and being able to actually decode signals which have just been very noisy for the last 100 years for EEG technology, which is fascinating. And now we're seeing so many different form factors like Temple with their patch and obviously the headphone piece, but obviously there's a company called Theta Neurotech, a wearable patch behind the ear for epileptic seizure detection. It's similar technologies bleeding across the consumer and the device world, which is going to be really fascinating. And yeah, it's an exciting space. I think there's obviously a lot of money flowing into it at the moment, and I think the brain computer interface market again as well. I think it's loose definition of the term based on anything that's reading the brain and converting it into some sort of software tool, whether or not that's consumer or a Neuralink, for instance, is that's a broad spectrum of devices. But I think there's a big responsibility as well, and I wrote an article about this recently about foundational models for the brain and brain data and what happens with that. And it's a big neuroethics debate that there are people who are much more educated on than myself, but it's certainly a really interesting topic that is coming up a lot in the brain health space. Is that something that you, before we I guess maybe a nice segue into your work at Nexus, but is that something that was a big topic for you guys as you were looking at investments?
Yeah, for sure. The way I always think about opportunities, two things have to happen. I'm talking more about the space of neurotech and healthcare. So on one hand, you have to have a very clear clinical unmet need, right? A huge, an area that you really need desperately something that it's not available today that will improve the lives of millions of people. And I think that's unquestionably the neurospace, either neurodegenerative or neuropsychiatric, neurodevelopmental disorder that are clearly fitting that category, right? Because in acute need in the society. The second piece has to be done with the gap of knowledge. What is the areas that we have to discover that we have not discovered yet? Because the opportunities will always come from the new things that you acquire, right? The new knowledge you acquire. So when you combine the clinical need I was saying first with this kind of black box, lack of understanding, you put it together and it fundamentally is an area poised for disruption. And when it comes to BCI, to me, the most interesting thing about BCI is that can the privilege to access the brain in a very temporal and a spatial high resolution, can that privilege, almost like premier real estate access, can that become an engine of innovation to formulate new hypotheses that can yield new interventions or diagnoses that will improve people's lives. So that to me is the thing that is most attractive. Now the question, if you're an investor, is how you make sense of that from a return of capital. And my my perspective in most of the, I'm not talking about maybe Neuralink and Elon Musk as a constraint on capital might be different, but for most of the other companies, how you actually bridge that gap to ensure that the first products and services have a path to success, right? And so often direct BCI first markets have relatively low TAM. So can you create more clinical value with labels and indications that will justify the physicians to prescribe that and patients to accept an invasive surgery, so that you can start expanding that indication bottleneck that I just described in the beginning of the presentation, and then take that and go to the next, and get the flywheel to start running.
Yeah, it's a fascinating space, isn't it? I mean, I would love to kind of take a step back and think about your move into Nexus then, and what happened from the Google spin out, what that role looked like, and then what the logical progression was into that space. And yeah, I'd love to hear that story, because it's quite a unique move.
Well, I mean, honestly, sometimes in my career, it's not like I've been directly pushing for something. It just things just happen. So as I was in discussions of because Verily was shifting a strategy, and if you want to invest in medtech, you really need a 10-year plan with a very different type of model of return of your internal investments, and Verily became more of a fundamentally software company and a service and software company. So I was discussing kind of next steps and opportunities. So the chance to actually found a venture capital firm that will allow me to go back to my initial roots on the brain kind of came up, and that it felt to me it was almost like a very strong mission-driven opportunity, and I want to try it, and also I wanted to learn what it means to be in the other side of the fence, not being an operator and working in companies, but being in the investment side, and that was really a fascinating journey.
Yeah, it's a completely different world. I mean, I've been lucky enough throughout my career to work across different industries, not even just neurotechnology, but hedge fund, investment banking stuff, private equity within renewable energy, and then obviously now interacting with investors on the neurotech side. But the background that you see of investors across most industries comes from usually a more traditional investment route. So, maybe a master's in economics, and then, PhD in something specific to finance. What you see a lot in neurotech is a much more specialized scientific background.
Well, because particularly with early, I mean, if you go to growth stage funds, crossover funds, or public investments, then the analytical, the analysis and the modeling of that return becomes very central. The more a classical researcher. In the early stage companies, it's almost like a hurricane in the beginning of the formation, right? You have all these sensitivity parameters. Who knows where it's going to go? So it means that there's inherently a lot of uncertainty, and the data that you have is limited. So how you translate the very limited high uncertainty data into a conviction, right? Investment conviction. And often it's not about financial modeling. The financial modeling is the least relevant thing, because anybody can do that. And by the way, with all these AI tools, you don't even need a person to do that. So it's all about understanding, first of all, a clinical piece. Is this really addressing something is worth addressing clinically? Is the solution consistent mechanistically with how to solve the problem you want to solve? And do you trust, and you think that the founding team and the CEO have what it takes to actually run with it? Because it's a long and hard journey for any of these companies. So, and often if you think about these, it's really not about understanding financials. It's about understanding the clinic, understanding some of the technology pieces, and a little bit understanding the psychology of how to assess greed and
Yeah.
commitment, things like this. So not much finance modeling there.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, it makes sense as well. I think a lot of the people I speak to are this, investing in the early stage neurotech companies, and it's not just neurotech, obviously, it's the broader medical device and scientific community across biotechs too. But it's very much about scientific due diligence and understanding what that, the immediate roadmap looks like. It's the technology, it's the research, it's the science behind it, then it's the clinical pathway and the regulatory side. And then the commercial stuff obviously is important and comes afterwards, but such early stage businesses,
The
10 to
early
20
stage,
headcount.
but as you said, though, because we did also invest even in crossover rounds.
Mm,
So in those cases, financial modeling and credibility on their sales forecast in like 5 years is kind of become the thesis of the investment. So in cases like this, I just don't want to oversimplify it. And in cases
mm.
like this, the proper modeling is crucial. But even with startups, while you need to focus on clinical and tech, and it's not a bad thing, though. It's actually a very important thing to also think a little bit ahead in terms of not just your regulatory pathway, but how combine the regulatory activities with reimbursement, health economics,
Mm.
because you still need to answer the question to investors, even the early investors, who's going to pay for it and why. So, as an advice to founders, it's never too early to start thinking about how to integrate regulatory and reimbursement in your plan.
Yeah, that's often a conversation I have actually with startup founders, CEOs, and so forth. And like, when is the right time to make that first commercial hire? And sometimes that commercial hire is, head of market access or a chief commercial officer that's worked heavily in market access. Everyone now is talking about market access more and more. Not that it hasn't been an important conversation, but it's certainly something I feel like in this day and age, certainly in some of the more traditional neuromodulation industries like spinal cord stimulation and deep brain stimulation that we discussed originally. I think that's a tightening of the reimbursement pathway.
Well, because also part of that is, if you look at the M&A activity of strategics, you really see a shift to more maturity, because
Mm.
now more and more companies want to see, in some cases, small acquisition over larger ones. They want to see an accretive acquisition where, there's already some sort of a proof that this is working and some initial commercial traction. So that means that the journey to privately fund these companies is much longer, and reimbursement starts becoming a central piece, right? If you
Mm.
don't solve that, then it's unlikely you can raise a lot of money. As opposed to maybe a few years ago, when in some cases there were more of a earlier maybe acquisitions where having an FDA approval could actually be an acquisition target, or people felt more confident, that having that is already a big inflection point.
Yeah, I feel like the series rounds now mean different things than they did 10 years ago. Like a Series A doesn't mean what it used to mean, and the Series B now is more of like we need to be seeing revenue at a Series B round, which is not what it felt like a few years ago anyway. So that's definitely the investment landscape is certainly shifting. I mean, I would love to know about, and we can get into the future of yourself in a sec, but like what were the main exciting investments that you worked on? Not that they have to be favorites, but you've worked with some amazing companies during Nexus. I think the INSIGHTEC stuff has been really, really fascinating to see, bringing that focused ultrasound technology to the market and making it way more mainstream than it was prior to that. But what other sort of companies and technologies did you really, really enjoy focusing on during your time?
I mean, I'll go back to these areas that I think are the biggest opportunities, and the scalability and market and patient access is a code that we need to crack as an industry. So having less invasive technologies that can be plugged into the patient journey, that also includes more invasive technologies as the diseases might progress. So thinking more holistically about that journey and how the various diagnostics or interventions plug into it, that it is a perspective that I felt was very compelling of what we were doing, and that may enable referral pathways, because before you have a conversation about having an implant, if you have a technology that can do that without having to open your skull, that might be an easier conversation to have, to accept, and also the economics will be lower. So it's almost like, how can you see these more of how to connect the dots better? and companies that are part of that story of connecting the dots, to me, it's what felt super exciting. And when you talk about INSIGHTEC, we had also another company called Cala Health, which was even earlier in the journey, right? Because this was like a watch-driven neurostimulator, very completely non-invasive, that addresses a certain need. But you can connect that to the INSIGHTEC focused ultrasound, and you then can connect the focused ultrasound to deep brain stimulation, right? You have all the 3 levels of invasiveness, and that was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's exciting, isn't it? The different form factors in neurotech as well are really, really great to see. And I think there's a lot of portfolios of businesses out there right now which cover the full spectrum, and everything from sort of software, foundational brain models we discussed before, all the way through to the traditional, still implantable devices being built. There was what felt like a bit of a shift over the last few years of going, how do we improve the patient experience and give them options prior to the implant, which was generally the neurotech solution, the first port of call. And to now, there's, like you said, like the Cala Health wearable tremor. There's a couple of those tremor devices out there right now to wearable. We're seeing even in the urology market too. I think Ovation Medical raising a lot of money recently for a wearable tibial stimulator, which even that technology feels pretty new. And then we've already shifted to wearable in that space. So really, really exciting developments in that space.
But it's also, there's a challenge because the traditional procedural-based model have a strong incentives, right? The hospitals make money with the surgery, the prices are high, so you don't need a lot of volume to grow the business. That's kind of a part of the explanation why the CAGR on the procedures is half of the CAGR on revenue. So, but examples like Cala Health, the most intriguing thing to me was, can a company break the ceiling of making a profitable business case with the constraints of a DME model, right? Where it's more, there's kind of different incentives, and that, as an example, I think can be very valuable for other companies to follow with the success of Cala. So disrupting business models is another piece of the story.
I mean, obviously there's been some news recently about Nexus, and I'd love for you to kind of give your side on that. I'd love to know what the future holds for you now as well. I think there's obviously a lot happening, a lot of really amazing stuff happening in neurotech right now, and I'm sure your journey isn't over just yet.
Yeah, it's not over yet. Mostly because the way I kind of think about this is mostly on the curve of time versus learnings, and I continue to have the same desire of learning I always had, and yeah, the brain is, and neuro, and in general, medtech continues to be an area of a lot of potential excitement. So my objective is continue to have a conversation with people, with entities, in finding mechanisms where what I've learned through my journey can be useful, because that's what you aspire to do, right? You aspire to actually do things that matters. So that's what I'm doing now.
Fantastic. So what excites you then about the neurotech industry right now? What are the new cutting edge fringe technologies that you think are worth noting? And what do you think the future of the neurotech investment world looks like? Because there's a lot of money flowing in right now from maybe non-traditional, even life sciences investment companies.
Well, in neuro, I mean, there's many areas, but I do feel that the area of neuropsychiatric disorders, or so you can almost use the analogy of hardware and software in a very simplistic way. When you have a neurodegeneration, your neurons die, right? And depending on where they die, you have Alzheimer, you have Parkinson's, etc. It's almost like a hardware problem where it's much more complex than that. So I'm oversimplifying. In neuropsychiatric disorders, for the most part, as far as we know, well, neurons don't die. It's all how they are connected. The connectivity is very important. And and if you look at the approved indications, there's TMS for depression and some VNS, but there's not a lot has happened, but it's a huge unmet need, right? Huge. Just the autism alone, the spend on the society on autism is mind-boggling. It's like, it's extraordinary. So, using the fact that the nervous system and the brain uses electricity as a means to communicate, that's kind of a software piece. It's a very natural fit with technology, right? Because technology know how to talk about that. And drug development, which usually is about like connection, one molecule with another, it's only one little piece, I think, of the story. So I do feel that neuromodulation connected with psychiatric disorders is just a field ripe to explode. And particularly now when you have a variety of interventions, right? You can have, as I was saying, focused ultrasound, where you can have very precise, deep and precise modulation targets. Then you have more superficial, less precise, but maybe easier to do, like TMS, for example. You can even use optical stimulation. There's there's all these tool sets that, with the data to personalize patients' interventions, will give you the flexibility to really make something that was not possible before.
That's definitely the area that comes up a lot. Neurodegenerative and mental health, essentially, are the two. Brain health, I suppose, is probably the best way of describing it. It's probably the best, the most talked about in neurotech. I think in this year, maybe most of last year or two. I think there's obviously some really cool innovation happening elsewhere, but it's the hottest conversation, I think, right now. So really exciting to see what innovations come from that. I mean, there's a lot of investment flying into it too. So
yeah.
But Jordi, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate you taking the time to chat today. It's been really interesting. Very excited to see where you end up next. I think there's a lot of really, really cool things you can probably get your hand bitten off for to get involved in, I think.
Oh, thank you, Chay.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye. This podcast is brought to you by Carter Sciences, the headhunting practice that covers not only headhunting, but also fractional talent work for startups who need help but don't want to spend those big recruitment fees, wanting to work on a more hourly basis with companies, and also career coaching for neurotech professionals. The goal is to provide cost-effective solutions across all neurotech hiring needs.